I always thought office revenge stories were exaggerated. Until my boss tried to ruin my entire life over a 5-minute favor I refused. Look, I'm not the type of person who looks for drama. I work, I go home, I keep my head down. Corporate life is boring, soul-sucking, but it pays the bills and keeps the lights on. I've spent the last 4 years at the same mid-level job at a logistics company, and until last summer, I didn't think anyone there even really noticed me. My boss, let's call him Greg, was one of those middle-aged guys who probably peaked in high school. The type that played football, wore the same cologne since 2002, and thought calling female employees sweetheart was charming instead of wildly inappropriate. But hey, whatever. Greg left me alone, I left him alone. It worked. Until it didn't. It all started with something stupid. Like, mind-blowingly stupid. Greg was applying for a loan to renovate his vacation house, and apparently, he needed someone to sign as a professional character reference. I didn't even know that was a thing, but whatever. One morning he called me into his office, shut the door, and handed me a form. "Just need you to sign this real quick, buddy," he said, smiling like we'd been friends for years. We hadn't. We'd probably exchanged fewer than 50 words since I was hired. I read over the form. My name, my job title, and a box to confirm I'd known Greg professionally for over 5 years and could vouch for his integrity and financial responsibility. I had not known Greg for 5 years. I wasn't about to sign legal paperwork lying about it. I laughed nervously and slid the form back across the desk. "Sorry, Greg. I don't think I can do that. We haven't even worked together that long." His face didn't change at first. Just a little pause. Then he nodded slowly, picked up the form, and tapped it against his desk like he was straightening a stack of papers. "No problem," he said. "Totally understand." And I left his office thinking, cool. End of story. Spoiler, it was absolutely not the end of the story. The first weird thing happened the following week. I came into work on Monday, sat down, logged in, and my system access was revoked. No email, no internal software, nothing. Just locked out. Thought it was a glitch. IT guy came over, looked surprised, said, says here your credentials were deactivated due to department transfer?" Department what now? I hadn't been transferred. Nobody told me anything. Greg happened to stroll by while I was talking to IT and gave me this smug little grin. Must be some mix-up. "I'll check on it," he said, like he wasn't absolutely the one who ordered it. For the rest of the day, I just sat there, basically useless. Couldn't work, couldn't access anything, couldn't even email to ask what was going on. By Tuesday, IT had restored my access, but my workload had mysteriously doubled. Projects I'd never heard of, deadlines that were impossible to meet, tasks that didn't belong to me suddenly assigned under my name. Greg didn't say a word, just kept forwarding me emails with the same line. "Take care of this." "Thanks." It kept escalating. Meetings I wasn't told about. Reports I supposedly failed to submit, that I'd never been asked for. Little mistakes in the system that somehow always traced back to me. At first, I thought I was losing it. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe I actually was slipping up. Burnout, distraction, whatever. But then people started hinting. One of the senior analysts, let's call her Dana, pulled me aside one afternoon and whispered, "Hey. I don't know what you did to piss off Greg, but he's been talking about cleaning house. He's got your name at the top of the list." Cleaning house. Right. Because I wouldn't lie for him on a bank form. I figured HR would help. Spoiler, HR does not help. I scheduled a meeting with them. Sat down, laid it all out, the fake transfer, the workload dump, the weird administrative errors. Told them I felt like I was being targeted. The HR rep smiled politely, nodded, took notes. "We'll look into it," she said. Nothing happened. Actually, no, scratch that. Something did happen. 2 days later, I got an official email saying my performance was under review due to multiple missed deadlines and incomplete projects. I'd never had a single disciplinary note in 4 years. Now I had 5 in 1 week. The kicker? The deadlines I missed were from projects Greg had quietly assigned to me after the due dates had already passed. I started documenting everything. Every email. Every request. Every Slack message. I forwarded myself copies to my personal email in case I got locked out. I screen capped our internal system showing timestamps and task assignments. I wasn't going down without receipts. And it's a good thing I did, because by the end of the month, Greg escalated to full-on character assassination. He started telling people I was unstable. That I'd been lashing out at coworkers. That I might not be a good cultural fit anymore. People stopped inviting me to meetings. Group chats would go silent when I joined. I'd walk into the break room and conversations would die mid-sentence. This was a place I'd spent nearly half a decade of my life in, and overnight, I was radioactive. I started to feel it creeping in, the kind of dread you get when you realize you're the subject of a workplace smear campaign. The constant dread of knowing someone is lying about you behind your back, and no one will say anything to your face. One day, Greg called me into his office again. I thought maybe he was going to let up, maybe offer me some lame apology or at least pretend to be cordial again. Nope. He handed me a project file that was due the next morning. "It's a priority, Alex," Greg said, pushing the file toward me. "Make sure it's done by tomorrow." I glanced at the file. It was full of data reports I didn't even recognize. It was the kind of stuff that usually took weeks to compile. I looked back at him, eyes wide. "Greg, this isn't something I can finish by tomorrow. It's a huge amount of work." Greg smirked. "Well, we all have deadlines, don't we?" He walked out of the office without another word. I immediately forwarded the file to Dana, hoping she could help me get through it. She just responded with, "Good luck with that. He's been doing this to everyone." Sorry. I spent the night there, my eyes burning from staring at the screen, but by morning, I still hadn't even made a dent in the file. The next day, Greg walked into my office with a cup of coffee, sat down, and barely even looked at the screen before nodding to himself. "Guess you didn't finish it, huh?" My stomach turned. "I didn't, there's no way I could." "Of course, you couldn't." Greg's voice was colder than I had ever heard it. "But that's not my problem, is it?" He left the office, and I sat there, stunned. The feeling of being completely powerless in that moment was overwhelming. And I realized then Greg wasn't just trying to ruin my job, he was trying to ruin my life. That was when I snapped. I went to HR, again. This time, I wasn't leaving until I got answers. But when I walked in, the HR rep wasn't there. Instead, there was a new face, an external consultant they'd hired for employee wellness. I sat down, went through the whole story again, showed her all the emails, the screenshots, the evidence. She listened, nodded, asked questions, but her eyes never once met mine. She kept glancing at the door, like she was waiting for Greg to walk in and tell her what to do. "At the end of the meeting," she said, "we'll get back to you." And that was it. No investigation. No follow-up. I left feeling like I had wasted my time, like the system was already rigged. But then something strange happened. The following week, I started noticing little things again, small, bizarre things that couldn't be coincidence. I'd get messages from coworkers I'd barely spoken to in months, people offering sympathy, saying they heard what was happening. A couple of them gave me subtle advice on how to deal with Greg, some even dropped hints that they knew he had been targeting me intentionally. That was when I realized some people were paying attention. They had seen what Greg was doing, and they knew he was trying to break me. But Greg had made a huge mistake by isolating me. Because when you try to tear someone down, you don't just ruin their work life, you make them stronger. I was getting angry, and I was getting smart. I knew it was only a matter of time before I figured out how to turn the tables. It wasn't long before I started seeing Greg's cracks. One of my old friends, Mike, from the marketing team, messaged me one night, saying that Greg had been bragging about my failure at the company party. It didn't surprise me. Greg was the type of guy who liked to flaunt his victories, even if they were petty. What shocked me, though, was Mike's next message. He said Greg had made some pretty questionable comments about me during a meeting about my lack of work ethic. He had called me lazy, unreliable, unprofessional. It wasn't anything new. But Mike told me something I didn't expect. Greg said you'd have a nervous breakdown soon, Mike said. He's already planning your exit strategy. HR's in on it, and they're just waiting for you to crack. That hit me like a ton of bricks. My own department, my own boss, had been actively working to get me fired. It wasn't just about paperwork anymore. It wasn't just about a few missed deadlines. Greg had painted a target on my back, and HR had been complicit the whole time. They were all just waiting for me to implode, so they could finally let me go. But they didn't count on me fighting back. I started reaching out to other departments, asking about their interactions with Greg. I began to gather information, things they'd told me, things I had overheard in passing. I compiled it all, quietly, steadily, until I had a thick file of evidence. By now, Greg had crossed a line. His little game of sabotage had gone far beyond anything reasonable. And that's when I realized I wasn't just fighting for my job anymore. I was fighting for my reputation. And I was going to win. I didn't let up. Every day, I'd come to work with a little more purpose, a little more focus. Greg couldn't break me, not physically, not mentally, and definitely not emotionally. But I'd seen enough of his tricks to know where his weak spots were. The thing is, Greg was a creature of habit. Every morning, he'd park in the same spot, walk into the office at the same time, get coffee from the same break room. He had his patterns, and I was going to use them. I started staying late, working on projects Greg had assigned me, projects that he had no intention of letting me finish. I wasn't just checking off boxes, I was documenting everything. Every misspelled email, every misplaced deadline, every shady decision I could track. I was building a case, brick by brick. I didn't know if it would work. But one thing I did know was that if I went down, I wasn't going down without a fight. One morning, about a month later, Greg's routine changed. He didn't show up at his usual time, and there was no email from him about the meeting we were supposed to have. Something felt off, but I didn't care. I kept doing my work, double-checking the reports I had to submit. Around 11 a.m., I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick it up, but something told me to. Alex? It was Greg. But his voice was different, distracted, almost panicked. Hey, I just wanted to give you a heads up, he said. I think someone might be going through my emails. My personal ones. I noticed some things were off. I froze. Was he trying to cover his own tracks? Was this some kind of weird manipulation tactic to make me panic? But I played it cool. What do you mean, Greg? There's no time to explain, he said quickly. I'll be gone for the rest of the day. Make sure you finish that report. Don't mess it up. If anyone asks, you're handling it. He hung up before I could say anything. I sat there, staring at the phone for a long time. Was this his way of trying to backpedal? Or was he trying to get me involved in some kind of mess to protect himself? One thing was clear, Greg was losing control. And that meant I had an opening. I acted fast. The next morning, I went straight to HR again. This time, I wasn't waiting for someone to tell me it would be okay. I was going to demand accountability. I walked into the HR office with a thick folder under my arm, full of printouts, screenshots, email chains, meeting notes, everything. The HR manager, a woman named Linda, looked at me with that same bland expression, like she had been expecting this moment. Alex, what can I do for you today? She asked, her voice almost patronizing. I placed the folder on her desk, watching her eyes widen as she realized I wasn't just making vague complaints. I had proof. I've had enough, I said, keeping my voice steady. Greg has been sabotaging me for months, and I have the evidence to prove it. I've tried to play by the rules, I've tried to work with him, but I'm done. This is not just harassment, it's a targeted campaign to ruin my career. She skimmed through the files, nodding now and then, but not saying a word. I couldn't tell if she was considering my case or just trying to get me to leave. Finally, after what felt like forever, she closed the folder and looked me in the eye. You know this is going to be a process, right? You're going to have to wait for an investigation. It won't be quick. I don't have time to wait anymore, I said. I've been patient, but I'm not going to let this man destroy my life. Linda didn't reply, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. I didn't care if she liked me or not. At this point, I just needed the paperwork to get started, and I needed it fast. The next couple of weeks felt like a slow-motion train wreck. I was still working, still showing up, still doing my job, but everything had changed. I was no longer just a disgruntled employee. I had become the threat. Greg started to pull his weight around the office even more aggressively. He'd lurk outside my office, watching me work with this strange, satisfied look in his eyes. When I looked up, he'd pretend to be busy, but I could see the gleam of victory in his gaze. I was on the edge of breaking, but I couldn't. Not yet. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. One morning, I walked into the office to find a letter on my desk, an official one from HR. My heart sank when I saw it was a warning for unprofessional conduct. It was from Linda. I opened it, my hands shaking. I had been accused of being disruptive at work, of undermining my colleagues, and of causing emotional distress to my coworkers. The worst part? It was signed off by Greg. Greg had gone straight to HR and framed me for everything. All the sabotage, all the blame, it was now on my shoulders. I couldn't believe it. Greg had actually done it, he had managed to frame me for everything. The emails, the missed deadlines, the so-called unprofessional conduct, all of it was now my responsibility. I had expected a battle, but not like this. I thought I could handle Greg's games, but this was beyond anything I had imagined. He wasn't just ruining my career anymore, he was trying to break me mentally. But I wasn't going to let that happen. The weight of the warning letter was crushing, but I knew I couldn't back down now. I had come too far, and if I let this go, it would be over. That evening, I started making calls. I reached out to everyone I had talked to over the past few months, my old coworkers, my friends in other departments. I gathered every scrap of evidence I could find. It wasn't just about Greg anymore, it was about proving I wasn't the one who had been sabotaging everything. By the end of the night, I had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. I contacted a lawyer, someone who specialized in workplace harassment and wrongful termination cases. They listened to my story and agreed to take it on. They also suggested I gather as much evidence as I could about the company's practices, the HR reports, and the way Greg had been using his power. I spent the next few days putting everything together, cross-referencing emails, screenshots, and even the statements I'd collected from my coworkers. I built my case from the ground up, piece by piece. By the time the hearing came around, I felt like I had been preparing for a war. Greg walked in like he owned the room, his smirk never faltering. He was dressed in his usual suit, a look of false confidence plastered across his face. But when he saw me sitting across the table with my lawyer, the cocky expression faltered, just for a second. I could see it, the realization that this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. I presented my case with everything I had. The emails, the photos, the witness statements, and the official HR report that Greg had fabricated. I laid it all out on the table for the committee to see. Greg tried to talk over me, tried to dismiss everything I said, but it didn't matter anymore. The evidence spoke for itself. After what felt like an eternity, the committee made their decision. A few days later, I received the official verdict. Greg had been fired. But it wasn't just that. The investigation revealed that he had been involved in multiple instances of workplace harassment, and his manipulation of HR records had been far more widespread than anyone had anticipated. I had won. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had been under Greg's thumb, everyone who had been too afraid to speak up. But as I sat there, reading the official statement, I realized something else. This wasn't just about Greg. It was about the system that had allowed him to get away with this for so long. Sure, Greg was gone. But the company had failed me. HR had failed me. And in the end, I was the one who had to fight for my life. I walked out of the office that day with a sense of relief. But I also felt something else. A deep sense of sadness. Because no one should have to go through this. No one should have to fight for their dignity in a system that's meant to protect them. As I reflect on everything that happened, I can't help but wonder how many people are going through something like this right now. How many people are working under toxic bosses, being gaslit by manipulative coworkers, or forced to deal with a system that isn't on their side. The truth is, systems like this exist in almost every workplace. They prey on the vulnerable, the quiet ones, the ones who just want to do their job and go home. But the thing is, you don't have to accept it. You don't have to let someone walk all over you because they think they can. Sometimes, you have to be your own hero. Sometimes, you have to fight with everything you've got. And sometimes, that fight is worth it. Because in the end, it's not just about winning, it's about making sure you never let someone take your dignity, your strength, or your voice. I won, not because the system was on my side, but because I fought back. And that's the real victory. Looking back, it's hard not to feel a mix of emotions. Relief, anger, and even a little bit of sadness. The system may have failed me, but it also showed me my own strength. Greg thought he could break me, but all he did was make me stronger. The fight was long, painful, and uncertain, but I learned more about myself than I ever expected. And it's the kind of knowledge that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I'm not just someone who survived a toxic workplace. I'm someone who stood up for myself, who refused to be crushed by the system. And if you're reading this, if you're facing your own battle, know this: you're not alone. And if I can make it through, so can you.